and have the honor of introducing Francis Ghilès, who I've been reading for years, but we just met, so maybe you know him. Francis is a political scientist that has been writing for years on the Maghreb, so he's very well known in this literature. He's written for the top newspapers and journals, New York Times, Wall Street Journal, Le Monde, Monde Diplomatique, Romani, BBC World, Jazeera, CNN, you name it. He taught and worked in various universities and think tanks. Right now he's in Barcelona at the Center for International Affairs. He's, I guess, really a citizen of the world. From the pieces you circulated, there was one that I found really fascinating about your personal odyssey. Thanks for that. I mean, really a citizen of the world, at least trilingual, with ancestors spanning Europe and North Africa, and even some connections to some Berber roots, which I think is very useful today. We don't meet a lot of people that may have a feel of what's happening from Somalia all the way to Algeria and Chad now. So maybe if we have time, we will also get into this. Francis, thank you very much for being here. And today you're going to talk about can the revolution in Tunisia put North Africa back on the world stage. So perhaps you want to talk for 20 minutes to half an hour, and then we would open it up for a discussion.
With pleasure. Well, thank you very much for being here. It's my first visit to Boston in 25 years. My first visit to this school at any rate, so it is a great pleasure. Yes, the subject is indeed vast, and by asking you to put the map upside down, particularly if you, I mean, the whole of the Mediterranean, but if you put the Western Mediterranean, if we just focused on the Western Mediterranean, it just shows to what extent. First, Algeria is now the biggest country physically in Africa after the partition of Sudan. And if you added the pipelines which run from Algeria to Spain to Italy, and the Libyan pipelines which run to Italy, taking gas to Europe, one would see how closely linked the two sides of the Western Mediterranean are in terms of energy. But of course they are linked in a very funny way by history, because the North or the South have been conducting either trade or war, well, since the days of the Carthaginians, so it goes back 2,500 years. And at the moment, I think we don't know quite what we're doing, because the effect of the civil war in Algeria, of the rise of Al-Qaeda, or the demise of it today, I don't know, of 9/11, of course, has meant that one often gets the impression that despite the Euromed policy of the European Union, which was supposed to give a framework of cooperation between the two shores of the Mediterranean, one often gets the impression the Mediterranean has become a wall. In other words, that the North looks to the South in fear of the other. The other can be described as an Arab, can be described as Islam, it can be described as terrorism. But exactly as the expression war on terrorism became a kind of mantra which lost any meaning after a few years because it covered so many sins, a colleague of mine in the FT wrote a piece last Saturday explaining the word Arab and Islam has just lost any meaning in the Western language because it's stuck on everything. So, when you were discussing the troubles in Northern Ireland, I lived in England all those years, nobody said the IRA was Catholic, although they all were Catholic, but, crossed nobody's mind to say they were Catholic. So, that we have a real problem where, on the one hand, there's strong links. This goes for Tunisia, Algeria, Morocco, a family. If you take France, one half of the men of North African origin are married to French girls of European origin, and more than a third of the women of North African origin are married to Frenchmen of European origin. So integration at a certain level is working well, and yet we look at the electoral campaign in France today and everything is on politics of identity. Now, admittedly, it's not just in France, it's a more general phenomenon which is not helping. Now, coming back to Tunisia, I was in Tunisia, I left Tunisia 10 days or 12 days before the riots started in December 2010. And I although I was brought up in Tunisia from the age of 7 to 13, just before independence and just after independence, I had not been back to Tunisia very much in the 10 years before. Indeed, I had refused to write even on Tunisia, despite entreaties from the president's family, because I just felt that Tunisia had become such an open-air prison. It was becoming so unpleasant that there's nothing more you could do. And all the meantime, while organizing conferences in Barcelona, where I live, or elsewhere on the Mediterranean, economic exchanges, how to, if not integrate, at least to have a better level of economic cooperation between the two shores of the Western Mediterranean, I was faced with everybody explaining, from the World Bank and the IMF downwards, to governments in Europe, that Tunisia was the model boy of the class. And the argument was, well, it's a dictatorship, that's not very pleasant, but economically they are blazing the path. And between 2000 and 2005 and 2010, when the regime became, from just being bullies or unpleasant, they became mafiosi, basically, became a mafiosi state, at least at the top. And I would always ask, but how come that capital is leaving Tunisia faster than in previous years? And the phenomenon of capital flight had been of great interest to me, because ever since working at the Financial Times on capital markets, capital moves, as we know, freely or officially or unofficially. But when you look at capital flight in the Mediterranean, it's interesting. You've got an estimated $500 billion of private sovereign capital, i.e. from Lebanon to Morocco, which is outside the frontiers of those countries. And you think to yourself, 500 billion, well, as we know, these are estimates, so even assuming it was 250, which would be too low a figure, then you think, then everybody's speaking about development. The problem is not development, the problem is trust in government, vision of a future, because you cannot develop. And if the leaders of those countries are taking their money out, why should we Europeans or even the World Bank be bothering about putting money in? In the case of North Africa, of course, the biggest capital flight, because there's a lot of oil money, is Algeria. But Morocco, the percentages of capital fleeing over the last 20 years are the same, despite the much vaunted stability of Morocco. And then in Tunisia, there was always capital out. But after 2005, the flight became, you go and see bankers in Paris or London, and they can estimate things. There's always a fork within. Nonetheless, we had this phenomenon of capital leaving Tunisia faster. And whenever I raise this question in a very technocratic language in conferences, there'd be dead silence. The Tunisians would look stony-faced, the Algerians would smile, the Moroccans would smile, and the Europeans were either uncomprehending or didn't want to understand or whatever, but the question was never answered. And of course, as I went back to Tunisia once a year, usually to a grand wedding or something like that, and you sat in these grand weddings, and you looked at the Tunisian elite behaving, and you realized they were spending money. They who were more modest and who liked to live well, and then by the late 2007, 8, 9, you had weddings which began to resemble weddings in Morocco, where it was just no holds barred. The amount, the money, the four-wheel drives, the Mercedes. You just thought to yourself, but where is all this money coming from? There's something, you just have to look around. You look at the jewelry the women were wearing. And some friends would say to me, go to these weddings, and they would say to me, and they whisper to me, not a very pretty sight, huh? But the World Bank, the IMF, everybody's very happy. It's doing very well. Mr. Ben Ali has got yet another prize for such things. And we had unmistakable symptoms of what was going on when the yacht of the chief executive of one of the most prestigious banks in the West, Lazare Frères, Michel, I forget the name, in 2005, his yacht was stolen in the port of Bonifacio in southern Corsica, and lo and behold, a few months later, it was found in the port of Carthage, repainted, and belonging to a nephew of Madame Ben Ali. And the interesting thing about this is, okay, these kinds of things go on, we know, all over the place, but France did nothing. It didn't try and pursue the people, nothing. Here we are, the laws of France, and I'm a French citizen, I was an Englishman, the laws of France have been, they've been insulted to the very face of the French authorities. And one of the leading bankers, not just of France, but Lazare Frères is London, New York, it is one of the emblematic business banks of the West, his yacht had been stolen, and this was normal. And you come to a point where you begin to wonder, I mean, what the hell is going on? Because, the rules don't apply. And, if the rules don't apply at all, then we are in trouble. So I came back from Tunisia on December the 2nd or the 3rd. I went to Madrid, and I was asked to go and see the diplomatic advisor of the Spanish Prime Minister. And we talked about Tunisia mostly. And I said to him, the day Tunisia blows, I have no idea when it was blows. I wasn't prescient in that sense. I said, the day it blows, I've seen Tunisia blow up in January 78 and in January 84. So the Tunisians are indeed softer than the Algerians and Moroccans. They're not given to... but when they blow up, you have to see it, you have to witness it. And he looked at me and he said, I agree with you, but you'll find it very difficult to convince anybody else. And so I said, well, I'm perfectly well, that's why I'm shutting up. And then 10 days later we had this. And so I was surprised, but the way it evolved didn't surprise me, because having covered, particularly January 84, the riots spread from the south up the same line of cities to Tunis. They came from the more deprived areas, but in 84, the difference between 84 and today, in 2010, 11, was that in those days there was still a policy of regional development, because the development had been concentrated on the coast. This had been made much worse by the development of tourism. And I'd read a wonderful piece written by one of your colleagues in Beirut, well, he's American, Walid Hasbun, on how tourism can serve as a, tourist development is very useful for dictators, because you get the impression there's development when in fact there's land speculation and money coming out. But tourism is very good to cloak. And, the difference between 84 and 2010 is that internal development had been abandoned. And when I went back in February of this year to inland Tunisia, to the Algerian frontier, you could see on the ground, and I went with friends from Le Kef, which is an emblematic town on the frontier because it's the basis of one of the great religious fraternities of North Africa, the Khadiriya, and you could see how the place had just been abandoned in the last 10 years. So differences which are already very difficult to correct, because the coast has many advantages. Tunisia has been run from the coast since the days of the Carthaginians, but nonetheless there'd been no pretense of doing anything. And in Tunisia it was summed up by the fact that the 21 big hospital centres in Tunisia are all in Tunis, Sousse and Sfax. That's all. Inland there is nothing. And you go just for universities, you look at everything. And so the poor was and that's where the revolt started. And as always now, the revolt started, I personally, as having been a journalist for 20 years, until 95 in the Financial Times, I'm not sure you can forecast history. But you can see that all the tinder is lying there. When it blows up is, of course, the million-dollar question, which probably nobody can solve. But it was very striking, two things, that in the days before the revolt flared in Tunisia, we had all the WikiLeaks on Tunisia. And it was quite clear that the American embassy had absolutely got it right. Whereas the French, at least at the level of the ambassador, was so caught up in thinking and doing business with Ben Ali and all the former ambassadors to Tunisia from France between 1995 and 2008 were all sitting on boards of companies which had been privatized for the benefit of the Ben Ali family. They didn't see it coming. Other people in the French embassy lower down, but the Americans from all the cables were absolutely spot on. And they described it, there is a cable from I think 2007 or 8, describing it as a mafiosi state. So, people in the West, a number of people knew. But there again, we faced a problem which I think is a broader problem of the World Bank, of the IMF, of Brussels. On the one hand, these are government organizations, so they have to abide by certain rules. But then the problem becomes, when does a certain amount of duplicity, which is inevitable, become complicit? And then when does it become really dangerous? Because if you're applying policies of aid, of loans, of trying to help people develop, there comes a point when if you're just pretending that is when it's the contrary, then I'm not quite sure what game we're playing. And I think this is a problem which is posed right across the board. And as I say, I'm not trying to blame the IMF and the World Bank, because I think these are very difficult problems. And maybe you worked at the World Bank. I mean, the figures were fake. I knew some of the figures were fake in Tunisia because I'd done some work on some figures in 1993. And I discovered that Tunisian olive oil was exported to Italy and then dressed up as Italian olive oil. And I knew it was the Italian mafia who was in this game, but I could never prove it. And then I got hold of a report from Brussels in 1994, and I published it. I mean, Tunis and Rome and Brussels, dead silence. Nobody would comment on the article. Nobody wrote a letter complaining. Nobody would comment. Dead silence. Had there been a European Parliament which was more active, I mean, the mafia was involved. And, no, this is normal, we carry on. So I think that in Tunisia, the state of play in Tunisia today is, I think, the following, is that on the one hand, the country is compact, it is educated, compared to the other Arab countries, it's much better educated. Women are emancipated, have rights which they have in virtually no other Arab country, literally on the ground. So it's a compact country. There's no great sort of, there's a divided hinterland coast, but I mean, unlike so many Arab countries, there are no obvious minorities, be they Berber, be they religious, be they regional. So that is an advantage. It's relatively small. In the last year, the state has managed to hold the fort. The number of tourists has dropped by 50%. This is going to be difficult to retrieve, not just because of what's going on in Tunisia, but because of the crisis in Europe. The last 6-9 months, I live in Spain. My salary has been cut by 40% last year. People don't realize what's going on, even in the south. So you've got France, you've got Italy, all these, Germany can send tourism, Britain. So the number of tourists is never going to return to the level it was 2 years ago, and this is a lot of jobs, indirectly. It's a lot of jobs. And furthermore, I think that the tourists provided, whatever people think of tourism, a lot of tourists went to Tunisia, and the Tunisians, they would speak. For many Tunisians, 3 or 4 summer months, it wasn't just a question of having adventures with tourists. It wasn't just that. It's more than that. It's a window to the world, and somehow, it mattered. This is closed, so it makes life, that much less interesting. But in any case, there is the income. A number of hotels are closed. Tourism in Tunisia was always at the cheap end. I thought it was a mistake 20 years ago to concentrate everything at the cheap end. But when you're at the cheap end, you see much more that you can't pick up. In Morocco, you've got the upper end as well. So, you can balance it. In Tunisia, it was all at the cheap end. So the dinar has not been devalued. Even if the dinar was devalued, in view of the state of Europe, of the pessimism in Europe, I'm not quite sure how you can pick up the pieces. Then you have in the state companies, obviously you've had a lot of strikes because people are expressing discontent, which is perfectly understandable. There's also been in Tunisia a lot of creation of state jobs which are short-term. In other words, you didn't have the advantages of social security of cover. So what do? You give the workers long-term contracts, you integrate them into the system, but this is more expensive. So there are a lot of grievances. I remember the governor of the Central Bank of Tunisia discovering when he was appointed, having been at the World Bank 15 years and stuff, and having the cleaning ladies in the central bank had 6-month contracts where they were paid an absolute pittance. So a key body of the state was treating its workers in this way. So all these problems come up. And they are not all susceptible of easy solutions. So in the state sector, phosphates was a disaster last year. They lost half their production, exports of phosphates, phosphoric acid. The state is functioning, as you would say, a minima. The state functions at half-cock because nobody quite knows with the politics what's going on. So as a result, you get a rash of illegal building whilst borrowing money from the banks. That's fine for the time being. You get a lot of goods being stolen in, industrial sites and all that. No breaking of machinery. The Tunisians, in that respect, it's been fine. And so economic activity growth was negative last year. The way things are going, it's going to be negative this year as well. Then you have the side of the economy, which is the star side. In other words, companies which export high value-added products. Now, it's not a very big part of the economy, but it's very important. Gearboxes, harnesses for cars, electrical harnesses, spare parts of planes. Now, on this front, Tunisia has become the star of the southern Mediterranean. And all this is in the hands of a few families which have done a very good job, which often have companies abroad and all that. But here, in some sectors here, you're beginning to get a problem. Because of absenteeism, because of people asking for their rights, many of these factories and workers are well treated. But instead of getting one faulty item per 1 million, you're now, in some factories, getting 10,000 faulty items per million. Now, this game can continue so long, because if it lasts for another year, say, then you risk losing your position, because competition is ferocious. And therefore, it's holding out, but there is a question mark here. And then you come back to the politics. Everything brings you back to the politics because stability. And investors, there are less investment projects this year than last. Investment held up quite well last year, but uncertainty and the kind of cultural wars we're getting with amongst the politicians will not help. And even if the West has helped, I mean, the central bank has managed to mobilize through the World Bank, through the IMF. They've got a number of credits to keep going. They got over $1 billion last year. They can get over $1 billion this year. They've reduced they've loosened monetary policy. Of course, that's encouraged inflation. They've loosened the requirements, the deposit requirements of the banks, but actually they can't do much more this year. So the situation is not all that bad, but it's not all that good. And the problem is, if it lasts for another 9 months like this, where do we go? That's really the question. Meanwhile, the politics are complex because we get an election last year, we get plurality of votes for the moderate fundamentalist party, Nahda. About half the electorate didn't vote, but then in view of the, in all these countries, they have a proper electoral roll. It doesn't happen overnight. Nonetheless, the problem of having half the country not voting, or not able to vote, is that if decisions are taken on Sharia law by people who represent 40% of the electorate, but in fact 25% of the Tunisians over 21, that can cause enormous aggravation. Like in Algiers 20 years ago, a lot of people didn't vote in December 1991. So if you start taking decisions on Islamic law and all that, which you know are going to divide society, on the plurality of a poll where half the people haven't voted, the question of is this democratic or not, it becomes all very problematic, and the West tends to cheerlead, democracy. But democracy, we forget in the West that democracy didn't happen overnight. And so the politics are complex because the government, as it stands today, is dominated by Nahda. Nahda are deemed to be moderate fundamentalists. I'm never quite sure what the word moderate means. I mean, all these words have become a bit funny. The problem is here they're playing with Sharia law. They say Sharia law's got to be in the constitution, and they backtracked 2 weeks ago. But the problem about pushing the Sharia law business in a country like Tunisia, where, as I say, women acquired rights which they've got nowhere else in the Arab world, is that it divides society. The elections have divided Tunisia. They have not healed the wound of that. I mean, Ben Ali is one thing. They've divided Tunisia. Then you have the role, and this is the economic consequences are grave. The Salafistes are hardline, right? They're prepared to confront with knives, with insults, with attacking women, with tearing the Tunisian flag. The problem with the Salafistes is that who are these people? Now, when you go to one or two provincial towns, you get the impression that half of them are the local bad boys, because all prisons were opened last year. There are people dealing with drugs and all that. Then you've got the Ben Ali militias, which were disbanded, had a lot of money. Are they financing things? Nobody seems to know. And then you have the people who are coming back from the Middle East, Tunisians who were banned for years and who are hardliners. Some have fought in Afghanistan, others haven't. Or you get a phenomenon which is causing a lot of aggravation. You get an Egyptian preacher coming when I was there in early February, and he speaks to 3,000 people in Tunis, and he speaks of infibulation. He explains it's the Quran. So if you do that in Tunisia, where the women have had family planning since 1962, you really raise the temperature. On top of it, he says it's the Quran. So, of course, this not only causes enormous aggravation, not just in the bourgeoisie, but amongst women and men elsewhere in Tunisia. But, of course, the images it projects of Tunisia in Europe, particularly in France, are a disaster. It's not going to encourage tourists to come. You get this kind of business going on. And on top of it, on French television, nobody's capable of explaining that infibulation is not Muslim. It just happens to be Egypt, Sudan, Ethiopia, parts of Eastern Africa. It's got nothing to do with the Quran. So all this, but the fact that this man preaches, and how did he get in? How did he get a visa? Then a week later, an editor is arrested because he's published in his newspaper a photograph of a Tunisian football player, very well-known one, who's with Real de Madrid but has German nationality, and his wife very scantily dressed. But this was published in a German magazine with the full agreement of the footballer and his wife. So this is published in Tunis. The guy's arrested. But what is this business? You can have preaching, people preaching that infibulation is Islamic to 3,000 people in the center of Tunis, then going to other mosques and going to the holy mosque in Diwan, which is the third holiest city in Islam, or the fourth, depending on how you view it, and preaching this against the governor's orders. And in Diwan, half the congregation walked out in disgust. And meanwhile, you're starting to arrest journalists, suppression journalists. So it all creates an atmosphere. I'm not saying Tunisia on the edge of civil war. I don't think so. It all creates a very heavy atmosphere, and one which does not help. And so we come up with this problem of, if Tunisia can somehow solve its problems and marry a greater plurality or democracy, it will take time, and managing its economy reasonably well, quite obviously for the whole region it would be important, because in the Arab world, one of the problems is nobody has been able to give an example to the others. In other words, the Gulf states, the Tunisian, at least the money they've got, whatever Qatar, all that do, it's fine, it's very interesting, but it can't be of any use to Lebanon, Jordan, Egypt, right, all these countries, right? If one country managed to have a plurality, or at least a greater respect for the rule of law, and manage its economy reasonably well, there is no doubt. Exactly like everybody looks at Turkey today. Turkey may not be a model, but at least Turkey shows that you can be Muslim and practice economic development and have a bourgeoisie and export goods and have, even if nobody is quite convinced AKP is a model of democracy, nonetheless, you go to Turkey, is a fascinating country to watch. So you can look up to them and say, well, maybe there's some tools in the toolbox here which are interesting. And I think Tunisia, because it's small and non-threatening, and people know, in Algeria, for instance, very important, in Libya, because Tunisia got the first Declaration of Human Rights in 1857, after the Bey of Tunis had traveled to Paris in 1847. They had the first Bill of Human Rights in 57, and the first constitution in the Arab world in 1861. Then the Prime Minister of the Bey founded the first modern lycée, the Collège Sadiki, a few years before the French invaded Tunisia in 1881. He formed a modern army. He paid senior civil servants. So Tunisia has a tradition, like Egypt or Turkey, or just remember, has this tradition of one of the first Arab countries which actually sought to reform. And furthermore, if you look at the laws in Tunisia, since 1905, most of the laws are edicted by the state. Ad-Dawla. It's very interesting. It doesn't come from the Quran or the Hadith. So Tunisia has a tradition, both in legal terms, in what is done for women, in the traditions before the French came, of trying to embrace modernity, to use a simple expression. And that is why what's going on in Tunis is so important and so interesting. Now, in the current government, the ministers have been appointed according to how many years they spent in prison. And this poses a major problem about Islamist parties, which I encountered in Algeria 22 years ago. The Islamic Salvation Front, because one forgets that Algeria went through this process of fast-track democracy and fell flat on its face. So my only hope is that we're not faced with something like this in Tunisia or elsewhere, because the idea you can become suddenly a democracy in 24 hours, I mean, this is where the West, a lot of people in the West, be it in this country or in Europe, I just find it intensely annoying, the kind of argument, because either you get the argument, they're circumcised, therefore Arabs, forget it, Muslims, democracy, never heard of it, this and that or the other, or you get the kind of preaching saying, yes, you've got to hold free and fair elections straight away. What about the judiciary? What about the enormous economic problems the country faces? How do you reconcile all this? And then we've got to have free and fair elections within 6 months. Well, maybe yes, maybe no. And it all becomes very simplistic. And I think we have a problem first in recognizing our own history, how long it took. And also, this is a question which the Europeans certainly don't like being asked, at least the French in particular, the Spanish or the Italians, saying, but what about the state of our democracy in the West at the moment, particularly in the European crisis? So, this poses a lot of problems. And in Tunisia, unfortunately, or maybe fortunately if there are elections in another 6 months and people realize, is that Nahda, whatever its qualities, does have nothing to say about running a modern economy. This was exactly the same as the Islamic Salvation Front in Algeria. The Islamic Salvation Front in Algeria 20 years ago, it's like Nahda. Nahda's a bit more sophisticated. The FIS people would say, oh, the loans from the European Union are haram. They're forbidden. So I wrote a piece saying, well, if they're forbidden, does that mean the IMF and the World Bank loans are forbidden? The next day, of course, the official press picks it up and says, the Financial Times is against the FIS. Fair enough. The FIS is serious with me. But I went to see the leaders of the FIS. I said, but sorry, you say you're going to take over the houses of the rich. Okay, you do that in Algiers. You've got 2,000 houses. Thank you very much for the problem of lodging. Okay, you've done that. Then what are you going to do with these? No, we said, they're haram, but that doesn't mean to say we're not going to respect the laws. I said, come on, you can't have it both ways, because there is a capacity of these people, and they're not alone in politics, to talk out of both sides of their mouths. But you're playing with a symbolism, which is very tricky. Because, of course, then you become hostage to a Western press, which is often hostile, there's no doubt. You're raising fears in Tunisia, not just amongst women. There are a lot of men. I've got friends who are 30, 40, men who are married with children. They their wives, they treat their wives as, they're like Europeans. So they are scared. And in Tunisia today, there's this feeling of fear. Now, it hasn't got, we're not on the edge of a civil war. Nonetheless, we're in a very tricky situation, and the headwinds from abroad economically are strong. So I think for the whole region, at least for North Africa, if Tunisia succeeds somehow in steering a course, staying stable, finding new policies economically, avoiding these culture wars, because culture wars do not create jobs. That's one very clear thing. Whatever they're worth, whatever this freedom of speaking is worth, it does not create jobs. And I think we're going to see it in Egypt after the election. I mean, who's going to create the jobs? Where are the jobs going to come from? So if there are no new jobs, what do we do next? And I'm not saying that creating new jobs is going to be easy, because, and I'll conclude on this, if you look at degrees in Tunisia, the standard of university degrees has gone down in the last 20 years as the process has gone more democratic. And indeed, the president quite openly, 10 years ago, made clear to his people around him that he wanted to have more access to university degrees, but by the same token, these university degrees get devalued, and they're not all that practical. So you get people out of university, and what jobs can they do? So we have a lot of problems which other countries encounter, but at the moment I feel Tunisia is poised on maybe a knife edge would be too pessimistic. I don't think it's quite as bad as that, but this uncertainty cannot last forever, because if you just take the number of people who are graduating in June, we've got about 200,000 or something, I forget what the figure is, so that's going to go to the unemployed. Then what happens next? Because they can't get out. Europe is closed in that sense. Where can they go? So Tunisia may not decide, the fate of Tunisia may not decide the broader Arab world, but there is no doubt that if Tunisia could succeed, even half succeed, that would be wonderful for everybody concerned, including for some Europeans, because it could convince people that this was worthwhile. Otherwise, I think we could have a counter-revolution. I wrote a piece on the Arab Spring, last December in Turkey. I think I wouldn't rule out a counter-revolution simply because, the economic headwinds are very, very strong at the moment. It's not easy. And the economy doesn't wait. Private investors can wait so long.
Thank you, Gilles. This was great. So let's open it up. We have a small group. We could just engage in a discussion. So Gilles, when you say the uncertainty cannot last, how can we understand that? Clearly, the uncertainties at all levels in that one doesn't know how in the medium and long term this marriage, as you say, of tradition and modernity would go, but it's impossible for this uncertainty to be resolved quickly. So perhaps one needs to think of how to live with this uncertainty.
Well, I think it's more a question that the uncertainty shouldn't lead to a decline in economic activity beyond a certain point, because I think it's more that. If you're not growing, it's one thing. If you're dropping by 2% a year, and the problem is when you're declining, when you're dropping, when the number of unemployed are going up.
So exactly, that takes you perhaps to thinking about what was the economic potential that wasn't taken advantage of during the Ben Ali time. I mean, on the one hand, the cronyism, the corruption must have led to capital flight because of anti-competitive behavior on the one hand, and maybe because, you know, people wanted to diversify. They weren't, the big families weren't too comfortable. Exactly. But also people say that this kind of state-led system taxed innovation, and that actually Tunisia or Tunisians are capable of doing more things, small businesses in more technologically advanced fields and the like. Do you feel like on the positive side there is an unused potential that can be unleashed by this political change?
I think there are two problems. One is that the informal sector in Tunisia is exploding. And the fundamentalist party, Nahda, finances itself in the informal sector. No accounts. The ports of Tunisia, you can get anything through today. You get weapons through. There's no control. Flood of Chinese goods. Now, you know, if you don't control the state, you know, the state is there to control the frontiers and all that, and then you've got the weapons coming in from Libya and all that. So the lack of control, you're not in a region also where the lack of control is very advisable. So on the one hand, you've got a control. On the other hand, the question of how much they're capable of innovating. Well, the Tunisians, I suspect this is true in most Arab countries, most Tunisians, I think, expect their state to help them. Now, whether this goes back to an older mentality, which we find partly in the West, we find it in Spain and France, but in the Arab world, where somehow there's something tribal or patriarchal where the state is expected to do certain things. But then the state, what is the state today? The state is on one hand the government, on the other hand you have a central bank run by somebody who's competent in terms of modern Western parlance. You've got the entrepreneur. So there are questions of redistribution of income. In Tunisia, the income disparity has become very great. So do you attempt any kind of income redistribution? But it's not just income redistribution, because last year the government created, 100,000 jobs, so they gave so much money for 6 months. That's fine. Or in the phosphate company, they created 3,000 jobs last autumn, just because it's the poorest region of Tunisia. But they created them, and the tribes were literally fighting each other, and there were dead people in the streets because everybody wanted their share of the jobs, which in any case hadn't been defined. So the problem is there's no time to think. There's no time to think. And I think furthermore, there is a problem in well, I don't want to use the word Washington consensus, because that might be exactly the right expression, but the privatization of the last 10, 15 years, privatization can be, and you know this better than I can be a very good tool of economic policy, but privatization, as it was practiced in Tunisia, was highway robbery. The problem is, surprise, surprise, they're not really finding it at all easy to get hold of the money of Mr. Ben Ali. And you may have seen a piece, it was a fascinating piece in the FT a few days ago, about how the man who ran Gaddafi's money disappeared a few months ago, and lo and behold, where do you think he is? Most probably in Paris, well protected. Because of course you can't imagine that the Europeans, I don't know about the Americans, I can't imagine the Europeans giving back any money they've managed to get sideways. They won't. And this is a very powerful tool of pressure, but this is not so in polite society. And the only pieces on the Ben Ali money, really serious, were published in the FT in January on Tunisia. And on Gaddafi, it was published last week. And this man is strongly suspected of being in Paris, where he benefits from very high level of protection. This is written black on white by one of the brightest young people on the FD, who's Iranian, who works out of Cairo, who's extremely good. This is not written just for fun. Clearly he has much more information he's giving. So you cut the frustration of not being, you can get hold of the properties of Ben Ali in Tunisia. That's what I would call that, how they manage that. The problem, the challenge for the government there is that those properties, what do? Do you redistribute them just to your friends, which is always a risk, these hotels, these companies? Do you sell them? Do you let the workers buy them? What do you do? Because that's very important for justice to be done and to be seen to be doing. But what do you do? Because the workers often were not involved in the frauds and all that.
Yeah.
But the money outside, I personally have my doubts as to, because if you take the money which is in France or Switzerland, the French political establishment has a lot to reproach itself about Tunisia. I cannot imagine anybody wanting to let out of the bag some of the stories. And the Libyan guy, the questions about all the Bulgarian nurses and the weapons from England, France, Germany, and all this. There's a lot of interest in the West, which are very keen to keep this under wraps because we would probably discuss some more unpleasant things. But that matters for ordinary Tunisians because they want to see justice being done. And in fact, it's proving that justice is very difficult to be done. And on top of it, they don't understand the niceties because there's all this bound up in legal things, and they've recovered very little of Ben Ali's money up to now from abroad.
Right.
And I would bet my last penny they won't recover much. It'll just disappear as so often before.
Yeah.
Yep.
No,
Go first.
Well, I've been working on a study on Tunisia on the tourism sector lately. I'm in the middle of it. It's not ended, but it's. So I was listening to what you were saying on the tourism sector very attentively, and my problem is the following: if they want to reform their tourism sector so that it diversifies from sun and beach only to other fields, and that it upgrades more added value. Say city trips, say cultural tourism, say medical tourism, which is big in Tunisia. They have to still concentrate on the urban areas. It's going to be about the medinas. It's going to be about the activities you get, like when you go to Barcelona. The innovation of Barcelona stands as an example of what you can do with tourism and how you can make it compatible also with improving conditions of life of citizens. So if that model, which is the most adequate right now for the tourism sector, gets applied, it still doesn't solve the problem of the regional distribution and the contrast there is between everything inside and then the cities, because you would be still concentrating on the coast, not necessarily on the beach, but on the cities on the coast, with a few exceptions, which are inside. So how do you do if you're the government? I'm asking a very specific question about what I'm doing, but I have other ones. How do you do if you want to diversify the sector, you want to upgrade it, but you still will have to focus on urban areas and not on rural areas in a context where the attention is asking you as a government to concentrate on the rural, which would be the wrong thing to do from a touristic point of view.
Well, the problem with the tourist sector is in the tourist sector you have a lot of loans which are unrecoverable.
Yeah.
In some of the leading banks in Tunis, you've got, I suspect, more than half the loans in the tourist sector just written off. That's one thing I never managed to get when I was at the FT was the size of the loans from the Société Tunisienne de Banque, the tourist sector. It hid a multitude of sins. A lot of it was land speculation. So you're probably going to have a huge write-off. Secondly, some people would go so far as to say that you should demolish a certain number of hotels which are not particularly well built up in that, because there's also the question of the use of water. In the use of water by tourism compared to the needs in agriculture. But I agree with you that you have to get the hotels on the beaches and the big cities moving. But you can also, there are other things to do which won't solve the problem. If I take a town like Ghilès, it's on the Algerian border, 3 hours from Tunis. It's got the most beautiful fortress in North Africa, Byzantine, Ottoman, all that. It's a town on the top of a hill. It's absolutely, the mountains around it are superb. And I have a friend who has a piece of land, and he would like to build a hotel there. All the plans are ready because Le Cap is at 600 meters. This would be for Tunisian tourism as much as for Tunisian because it's 3 hours from Tunis. It's up in the hills, very beautiful countryside, Roman ruins, the town of Le Cap and all that. But in the last year, he has not been able to move, very simply because the governor doesn't dare do anything. And the problem of stability, you see, is that if you want to do something, you've got a constituent assembly writing a constitution, but it's also supposed to be managing the economy. So the constituency, the constitution is going to take it's going to take until the middle of next year already. Now, how long can we go on, you see? On the other hand, if you want to, say, build a hotel there, the hotel juts upon part of the land belonging to the governor's house, which was stolen from a big family of Ghilès. And on this land, there are 2 or 3 shacks, not many. Now, in the present situation, moving anybody out of shacks or anything is extremely difficult socially. But I've seen the plans of the hotel, and it's a modern, ecological, very well done, where you've got 40, 50 rooms. And there you could have tourism all year round, because, you look at Le Kef at 600 meters on the Algerian frontier, the whole thing, you could fill it up. But the question there is the decision-making process. Is this government going to have the capacity to really be practical? Because these are practical questions. There are a number of projects which are there, but they need backing by the state. If the state is weak, which it is, a lot of the civil servants in Tunis are working half the time. There's a phenomenon which is a bit worrying, is that amongst the new ministers, they've tried to get senior civil servants to work in their kitchen cabinets. These people are refusing. Because they've said to the ministers, we will not, as much as we didn't like Ben Ali, we are not working ideologically. Because when the Minister of Tourism says, oh, we don't have any French tourists or that, we're going to replace it by religious tourism. And a friend of mine said, how do you want me to work for this guy? I said, I'm not against religious tourism. What's religious tourism? What does it mean? Okay, we can send people to Kerwan, if you wanted that on the coast. What are we supposed to do? This is not, these kinds of ideas. So there are a number of senior civil servants who are not at all happy. Now, whether they are cutting their nose to spite their face, whether they're going to have to learn to work with these ministers, I don't know. All this is inevitably uncertain.
The Minister of Tourism is from Takattul. He's not from Nahda.
But he's been saying things about religious tourism. There again, when don't forget that now the media are pretty free in Tunisia. So you can say things, you see, and the problem about these words is whenever you say something in Tunis, you get furious twittering and blogging within a few hours, and you can turn a minister to ridicule very quickly. So there again, are you savvy with these kinds of means? It's the difficulty of freedom of expression. And as I say, the problem isn't simple in terms of tourism.
Yeah.
Because it's not simple because the image matters. You know very well that in tourism the image matters. So if you want foreigners to come back, the question is image. And there you may not be helped by the French media, which play a big role in this. But you start talking loosely.
But this seems like adaptation, transitional problems, right? Not necessarily fundamental problems.
No. But as I say, the question is how long can you? I mean, maybe it's inevitable that you should have 2 or 3 years of floating. I think this is maybe it is just. I'm not asking to be, but the thing is, we have a government which is officially writing a constitution, but in fact is having to manage the economy. And it's not managing the economy at the moment. And an economy can go kaput. An economy can go belly over or can slip badly.
So the uncertainty comes from the long period for writing the Constitution, in your mind. That's the key element. Yeah.
And of course, writing the Constitution is giving rise to all kinds of arguments which are maybe worth having.
Right.
But there's sometimes the impression in Tunis that both sides are lining up their troops.
Yeah. But isn't the not? I mean, you talked about counter-revolution. I just want to. I started asking you about something quite specific. I'm going to go back to the big frame.
Yeah.
Okay. So just quickly, you talk about counter-revolution, and I'm not sure where would the counter-revolution in Tunisia come from.
Oh.
In Algeria, it's obvious that you had. In Tunis, no one, nor the liberals, nor the Islamics are the one in power, so that's already not one that's not going to make the counter-revolution. The liberals are definitely not going to go for a back to dictatorship phase. You're not going to find supporters for that among any Tunisian today, whereas you could have found that in Algeria. You cannot find it in Tunis. You won't have a support.
I would be less sure. I wouldn't rule. I agree with you. I don't think it's the case today. I wouldn't necessarily rule it out because I think these things are.
With the army, you mean? Or?
Well, the army is in the hands of people who are playing an interesting game. I mean, the police is in the hands of somebody who was there when Ben Ali was there, who was clean, but who very much believes in the Tunisian state. Mm-hmm. The problem is the breakdown of law and order. Mm-hmm. You see, because we're getting with the Salafi, the problem with the Salafis, it's not so much Salafi, when you get the Salafis, you get acts of violence and threats. And what worries me, well, I would say what concerns me is this atmosphere of fear, because I saw in Algeria, I witnessed between the feast being legalized in 1990 and, late 89, in late 88 or early 89, then municipal elections in April or May 1990. And the feast came out, and as soon as they won the municipal elections, what do? The first thing they do, they ban men wearing shorts. But it's not as if Bermuda, it's not as if in Algeria many men did, but nonetheless. Then they ban all music festivals, high music festivals. And you could sense within a year the fear. And then there were a few incidents. There was an incident, I remember it very well, in the south of Algeria, in Ouargla, where a woman who was divorced, lived with her 3 kids. She was burnt in her house. And this was the feast supporters saying, she was living, she was a prostitute.
But do you think anything like this is possible in Tunisia?
Well, we're getting some violent incidents. And the thing
Is there
about
the equivalent of the army? I mean, the army was very...
Oh, but the army
That's
is
the
doing an extraordinary job. But the army, the question of insecurity in Tunisia, I've got friends in England or cousins who want to go to Tunisia to visit Roman ruins in 6 months' time. And it's very difficult to advise them because, things aren't bad, but it's not easy. And, because you're getting armed robbery. And there are people out there loose with weapons. Don't forget the number of weapons coming in from Libya. They're on sale across all southern Tunisia. There are over 100,000 weapons have been disappeared to thin air. And nobody in Europe, all the people, the Americans, the French, or the English have gone all into all this. They couldn't care less. It's happened, 10,000 Tuaregs marched from Libya into Mali, and into Niger, Mali, nobody notices. Armed convoys with guns, with ambulances and everything. So there is the regional environment, which is pretty unsettled. The other thing you must always remember in situations like this, because you could see it in Algeria 20 years ago, is provocation. And as you know, one does not have to subscribe to the conspiracy theory of history to know. You can imagine the number of people who are crawling all over Tunisia from the Gulf, from Egypt, from Algeria, from Morocco, from Libya. And it doesn't take much. It doesn't take much. So it's always in these kind of situations, you say, okay, the people are wise. I mean, I would still trust the Tunisian people's judgment, but it's the question about women. It's bring knives out. The Salafis do it with knives. That scares people even more than guns. When they come out with knives, or they try and impose the burqa. Now, you try and impose the burqa on the campus in Tunis. It's been going on for 3 months. The government doesn't intervene. But I mean, for many Tunisians to try and impose the burqa, it's got nothing to do with the history of Tunisia.
Was the what?
The burqa, the complete veil, the Iranian style veil. So you're there, you're raising the temperature, and there you are pushing people. Now, why it's being done, who's doing it, I don't know, because we enter into very murky politics, we enter into all kinds of funny things and as I say, you don't have to be a believer in conspiracy theories. The Tunisian bourgeoisie is running scared, and not just the bourgeoisie as well.
But now, you can argue that this would lead to a loss of the elections, not of the elections, to cool. I mean, you're going to have a tsunami effect that's going to come and hit. But
if the elections, I mean, if the elections happen in 9 months and you get a free and fair debate, then you will.
That economy and Salafist means
that would be. I mean, I'm not ruling out that things will happen in this kind of way. I'm just saying we're in a very jittery period, and my fear, the question of the economy, since I'm focusing on the economy, is that the Tunisian economy is quite diversified. In a way, it's reasonably resilient. But when you look at the headwinds from Europe, the whole environment, the export markets, with a few things aren't good, the tourist sector, whatever the Tunisians do, the tourist sector is badly damaged, but it would have been badly damaged in any case. And the environment, the countries around, particularly Libya, it's very unsettling. And I'm just pointing to the dangers. The question, will they have the time to experiment? It's always the same thing. Will they have the time to experiment? In Algeria, there wasn't time to experiment because the reformists who were in power They were trying to run a country and make reforms when their debt payments were equivalent to 100% of exports of oil and gas. So you were really stuck. You had the French against them. But these acts, what I'll never forget in Algeria, is the acts, the threats. When this woman was burnt in Ouargla in 1989, it really sent a shudder through Algeria. I can't tell you, the reaction it had. It sort of comforted. Now, whether that was provocation or whether it was just an incident that happened, I don't know. But for the moment, there's no sign of real thinking about the economy, at least not much. And Western help is a sort of, in these circumstances, last year Tunisia got through the central bank over $1 billion. This year it can raise over $1 billion. So, the immediate future is okay. What happens in 6 months' time? I mean, it's not very good to say intellectually, keep watching this space, but I think there are a lot of question marks, and I don't know the answers. I don't necessarily think the worst is going to happen, but
You worried? Did you have a question?
Yeah, well, so if things go on through election time and then the new government can really focus on the economy, where do you think they should begin? Which sectors should they focus on first? What are the most important things for them to start?
well, I mean,
FDI.
the thing about an economy is that on the one hand, you've got to keep the private sector. The fundamentalists tend to officially, they tend to favour private enterprise. But on the whole, they've tended to favour private and informal trade, which is not the same thing. Because between private informal trade and running a company, exporting goods, it is not the same thing. So when people say Islam is in favour of free trade, yeah, fair enough. But it's got nothing to do with actually running a modern company. This has got to do with laws which are Western inspired or whatever. It's the same model everywhere, And if you start putting religion into that, that's not the problem. So what do you do? I mean, on what basis do you run it? What are the parties going to say? For the moment, the two lay parties seem to be pretty hostage to the Nahda, which has the biggest share of the votes.
Right.
And as I say, the Nahda people they may have been very worthy fighters for freedom, but their competence is not. So there's not all that much competence. And when you're running an economy, first there's a debate about, first there's the crisis of a certain model in the West where privatization has been given a dirty name, though privatization can be a very good tool. But when you look at the debate in Tunis with the press, which still has a lot to learn with debates, look at the debate during the French election, let alone the Tunisian one. The way the debate on economics is pathetic. So it's already not easy to have a debate, because a lot of people don't understand. Secondly, the whole idea of a more liberal thrust, to use these expression, has been dirtied, but maybe too much. I think the state will have to play a great role in the years to come, because I don't see how it can come. But then if the apparatus of the state, a lot of people are sulking or not happy, that's not a very comfortable situation, but maybe that will change in the months ahead.
And is there anyone talking about, like, for example, the laws that need to be created to bring the informal economy into a formal economy? Are people having those conversations?
Well, at least when I left Tunis in late February, no. The informal economy is exploding. And you see, there's a further problem about democracy, is that Nahda has got antennae in every town in Tunisia, and they've got a new headquarters in Tunis, in Montplaisir, a skyscraper. There is no accountability in terms of where the money comes from. So some people say it comes from Qatar. I suspect, knowing how they they function exactly like in Algeria, it comes from the informal sector. But that's dangerous, because you're taking people who don't pay taxes. And you've got the other people who are paying taxes. In any case, if you have a ruling party, which has these kinds of buildings, suddenly over 6 months they've acquired all these, where's the money come from? There's not a shred of evidence of anything. Now, if you're not transparent, at least if you don't have some idea where it comes from, it poses a major problem. Because when you get in Tunis in February, when I was there, the Emir of Qatar comes and great loans for so much percent. And then you say to some of the people, but I mean, sorry, there's Japanese money at 1/4 of the price. Why aren't you using that money? Why are you borrowing from Qatar? Well, Qatar is a political project. And in any case, money from the Gulf in North Africa, it's always been a mismatch, because it's always been used to fund tourism, in fact, land speculation. You can see it in Morocco, you can see it in Algeria. Or it's been used to get it to buy, say, a telephone company, like when the Egyptian, what is it, the Swahili's, the big telecom service.
I forgot his name.
Right.
Yeah.
They got hold of they bought a share, they got a license in Algeria through the leaders. They just milked the market, and then there was a big row and all that. So they get into a situation where they've got a rent. As in fact, it's quite an easy rent, and the number of people using mobiles is exploding. Then they walk away. And or in the case of the Swahilis in Algeria, they started also, that was complicity with the Algerian state, buying cement plants. And then they suddenly sell these cement plants to the French, and the Algerian government wakes up, and the whole thing has got nothing to do with economics, it's just trafficking. And very often you find that for the Gulf, investing in North Africa is not a priority. I mean, it's done for either political with a lot of money. And in North Africa, some people, like the Algerian government 10 years ago, when Bouteflika came back to power, I think he genuinely believed that his brothers in the Gulf will help him. Then he discovers they're predators. Now, that doesn't mean to say they're not predators in Europe or America, but I mean, a lot of companies in Europe and America and Japan and all that come, and they do a real job of building a factory, of developing and all that. The Gulf's track record in North Africa for 30 years is zero, basically. I've followed it for 30 years. And at a seminar we ran in Sudan a few months ago with for Ishac and Phosphate, we looked at this problem. And we looked at it through a business lawyer from Algiers, who's 32, born in France, son of a worker, came to Harvard Law School, absolutely brilliant, went to Algeria 3 years ago, set up a company in between the Gulf, Algeria, Paris, and New York. And he wrote me a paper, which is an absolute masterpiece, with 30 years of Gulf investment in North Africa. Well, it's not very convincing. So you come back to the fact that your investment is going to come not just from Europe or America, it's going to come from South Korea, from Singapore, maybe from China, from India, as investment from the Gulf. That's I have grave doubts about. Because, it hasn't worked. I mean, historically, the result is virtually nil. Historically. I'm not saying that elsewhere in the world where they invest or otherwise, but and it's always done through the top of very complicated deals, and then when you discover the thing, the Gulf set up banks in Tunis and the Saudis in 1980, 81. If you look at what those banks did over 10, 15 years, frankly, 90% of the time, what did it do? Develop? No. They put concrete in, they speculated on land, they got special licenses. The Saudi private Al Baraka group redeveloped the whole edge of the lake in Tunis. Al Baraka group, they came with some money and guarantees. They borrowed on the local market money. That's very often what happens. And in the development on the Berge du Lac in Tunis, they banned alcohol because the Sheikh Salah does not like alcohol. So here you are, the business center of Tunis, you can't drink alcohol in the country where a lot of people do. 20 years later, so what is this? The guys made a lot of money, walked away from it. Thank you very much. This is development? No, this is not. This is just speculation. I'm not saying the Western companies don't indulge in this, but you have to look at who's coming in, who's doing what. And the Tunisians are very clear on this in private. You speak to Tunisians, the Tunisians will all tell you that it's the Europeans, the Koreans, the Indians, all that they're happy with, but the Arabs, they don't trust at all. They know perfectly well.
Thank you.
Well, that brings up another interesting question. There's a lot of unique features in Tunisia, a lack of sectarian strife and very small and more integrated society. But the lack of investment from the Gulf, too, tends to illustrate the kind of Gulf, so to speak, in a different sense, between North Africa and the Middle East. Is Tunisia really, given the fact that it's very little coherence and symmetry to the whole Arab Spring uprising, a bellwether for the Arab world, or is it more the exception that proves the rule?
Well, that's a difficult one. I think that when I look at Egypt, I don't know Egypt, and clearly Egypt is going in a, it's the whole. I mean, the problem about the Arab world is that on the one hand, the grievances are common. but the situations in it, it's a very, very diverse world.
Yeah, and the Western interests are very, very different. In Tunisia, there's not as much at stake as there is in Egypt.
Well, I don't know if it's I mean, Egypt, the interest is there because of Egypt and because of the Israeli, all this business. But in Tunisia, I would have thought that in Europe, not just in France, but in Italy, the interest in Tunisia is very great because Tunisia is just across the water. And, for the French, whether Tunisia is more important than Egypt, I never know what these, because, in the world for 25 years, with North Africa was unimportant. But even when the Algeria went belly up in 1992, I found it very difficult convincing the FT that what was happening in Algeria was a very interesting sign of what could happen elsewhere. That, the Afghanis returning, the jihadis returning from Afghanistan to Algeria in 1989-90. I remember picking it up, but not realizing how important it was. A lot of people didn't even pick it up. And I remember in London, it wasn't just in London, people say, oh, well, Algeria. But people forget that during the War of Liberation of Algeria, this had a big impact on the Middle East, the Palestinians. I mean, you go to the internal, I went to this town on the Algerian border, Ghilès, and speaking, I was with a group of 2 Tunisian women who were actually coaching women to be citizens, to exercise their vote, to stand up for their rights and all that. Very interesting. So in a milieu of very humble women. And I was asked to speak. They all understood French. So, they asked me to speak because I know Le Caire. I mean, there are various family links with Le Caire and all that. And I was with a bunch of friends from Le Caire, and these were mostly 40 women. And, discussing headscarves and this and that. And I said, well, when your reaction to the West and how the West talks about you, if you look at television, they're looking at television. And they said to me, one of them said to me, our greatest humiliation over the last 30 years is Palestine. That was very interesting for me because I've always been convinced that the Palestinian issue, even if people are a long way away from it, it is, people are sitting there, they get the impression their nose is being rubbed in the dirt every day by what they hear from Western leaders. And this comes out in talking in Algeria and the provinces. People are a long way away. They just can't stand it anymore. They say it. So this, I think we don't know these countries. We've got to a point where, these countries, we know the elites. People go to Carthage and the coast, but they don't know what's going on in that. In Algeria, which is maybe more difficult of access, who knows what's going on in that vast country? People rush to Marrakesh. They have a nice life, the French elite and others. But, you go into the mountains 20 kilometers from there, completely different story. And I think we have a real problem. What do these people think? Because they're not, first, they're not stupid. Secondly, they're politically savvy. It's always been my experience when running around North Africa that when luckily I worked for the FT for 18 years, so I was able to, I could go to agricultural projects, farms, factories, those places in the middle of nowhere. And that's where you could talk to people. And I had the advantage because of background, because I bear a name which is Berber. My grandfather was baptized in Algerian Berber more than 100 years ago. And so in Algeria you'd sit in a cooperative farm. And,
Ghilès is a Berber name.
Ghilès means pantry in Berber. And so, and because I have a mother who is English and Jewish, I felt completely, and everybody knows in North Africa. I mean, I have another grandmother who's Italian. I just I felt at ease, and everybody knew it at a certain level. And then, you would sit in Algeria. This was under Boumediene, which was a very difficult period. You would sit there in a factory or in a cooperative in the depths of Algeria. At a time when in Algiers, in the mid-70s, you couldn't talk very easily. And then, you'd be shown around the factory, and I was usually the only journalist they'd ever seen, maybe a French, but even then, and I had to write economic pieces, just asking questions about this and that. And then you'd go to the canteen, this being Algeria, the managers and the workers would be sitting there speaking extra French. Then at one point somebody would say, would look, and then very shyly would say, "Sir, are you French?" Because I was presented as an English journalist, right? And then I would say, "Well, look, my name, you can recognize my name." And they said, "Yes, sir, that's what we thought." And then the atmosphere would relax, even in places, and then people would talk. And one of the things that I've learned over my professional life, that I learned a long time ago, is that you look at all these people and you think, first, the way their states were treating them as, just shut up and get on with the job. These people were not. maybe they couldn't be defined exactly in terms of a Western democracy, that women's rights were not the same. But the problem of many Europeans, and I suspect here it's the same thing, is to underestimate the sophistication of these people. Even the people who are not very educated, they are not stupid. They want to participate in the debate. But at the same time, in many places where they don't have the means, they don't, they're just surviving. And so often you got the problem which you can see in Tunis. I mean, Bourguiba did a remarkable job because Bourguiba implemented his rules on women, the laws on sexual equality for women, not like Atatürk by putting Islam on one side, but by saying, I am practicing Ijtihad, the interpretation of the Quran. So he integrated it into an intellectual and religious argument, which people can understand. That was the strength of him, because he was capable. He both thought as a French politician of the Third Republic, and he was a practicing Muslim. And that was the strength of that. But then in Tunisia, like indeed in the other countries, one banned the left, anything which was not just Marxist, but freedom of expression was curtailed everywhere. It was cut to nothing. So there was no free debate. So just when you're educating people, and the standard of education is obviously much higher today in all free countries, Algeria, Morocco, Tunisia, than it was 40 years ago, just when women are becoming more active, and even if in Algeria and Morocco they don't have the same rights as in Tunisia, the women of Algeria, during that decade of civil war in Algeria, the reason Algeria did not chip over into a fundamentalist state was twofold. One, we know, a dirty war by the army and the security forces. The second thing is that the Algerian women somehow collectively just said no to Sharia. That's never written about. Yet these women who went to work as lawyers, doctors, nurses, teachers, despite all the killings, despite the ghastly situation for people, they kept the whole show on the road. And today they still don't have equal rights. It's quite amazing. But these people are, in my view, there are a number of overlapping problems. But the difference maybe between North Africa and the Middle East is that on the one hand you have a regain of religious feeling, religious practice. Well, I don't know how you call it. I'm not a specialist of this. You can write across, fair enough in terms of identity. But on the other hand, the people look at the West and they understand the West. They understand it very well, and they want to be part of it. Not when I say part of it, they want to benefit from they want to benefit from what the West is, and they know the West is in crisis. They can see. Just imagine in North Africa, they're all flying backwards and forwards between France and North Africa, everywhere. You go into Toulouse airport or Lyon airport, you look at the flights to North Africa. Well, in Tunis it will be mostly Tunis, but there are flights to Constantine, to Oran, to Béjaïa, to everywhere, to Marrakesh, to Agadir. So there's an enormous link with Europe which does not exist in a country like Egypt. The links between Egypt and the Middle East are different. I don't know for Lebanon or Jordan, but in North Africa is sort of linked to Europe, not just France, in a way. Half the North African people, French of North African origin, the men in France, are married to women of European origin. 30% of the women of North African origin in France, the French citizens, are married to Frenchmen of European origin. So, we're already in a... And this is something which I sometimes think neither the government of France, which is my government, nor the North African governments actually recognize. And so, that's why in a way Tunis is important because it's not the Middle East. I wouldn't argue for the Middle East because I've been to Lebanon, I've been to Egypt a few times, but I don't really know. But North Africa, the links between the North and the South are so many. And how is it going to play out in the years to come? Europe is afraid. The French, look at the electoral process in France, where everything is built on la peur. We're afraid of Germans one day, the Americans the next, the Arabs or Islam the third. Who are we afraid of? We're afraid of everything. But somehow we don't seem to be looking positively at things. And in North Africa, the problem is, yes, democracy or plurality or expressing yourself, because these people are not stupid. Even their own leaders, when you think of how their own leaders spoke of them. I remember, as I say, in the late Boumediene days, talking to the Algerians were anything but stupid. When the joke in Algeria a few months ago in Oran, a group of friends who've all got jobs in their 30s, And they were saying, the joke was, this was a dinner in a restaurant, quite openly, saying, okay, this country needs a bit of order. We need to be recolonized. Okay, the Algerians got a very good sense of humor. We need to be recolonized. So, okay, we're going to recolonize. Who are we going to choose? We've had the French. One was enough. Let's move on to the second one. Who could we have? The Americans too far, right? Spain. Well, Spain could have been interesting a few years ago, but now look at Spain. Is Spain all that different from us? Very good question. Yeah. And so somebody says England, and so I said, no, I've got a much better candidate. And they said, who? I said, Israel. They look at me and they say, Israel? I said, yes, because I said, you want to be knocked into shape, really become an efficient nation. You know, there goes. And everybody said, raises their glass, that's a bloody good idea. You've got to take this a second remove. But I mean, nonetheless, you see, the Algerians can argue. There are times when I've given lectures in Algeria, at university, at Béjaïa. I remember giving a series of lectures 4 or 5 years ago, and some of the girls were wearing headscarves. I gave 3 lectures. One on the conquest of Algiers in the 1830s, where I wrote my thesis on it. The second one on American policy in the Middle East. And the third one on Europe and North Africa. I can tell you, the questions were more intelligent than I got in Sciences Po Paris a few years before. This is a real challenge everybody has, you know, that these people are, and I suppose in other Arab countries, people are not what they were 30 years ago. It's not just Twitter and Facebook and all that. The level of education has come up. Women are speaking out. Half the girls in Algerian universities are women. And it's not because they wear a foulard that they'll argue less against the men. No? So it's everything's happening at the same time. And what I find sad, speaking as a European or as a Frenchman, whatever my background might be, is that Europe seems to be, not all of Europe, but our leaders seem to be incapable of rising to any challenge on that front. That's what I find sad. Now, admittedly, we've got our own problems, but nonetheless, you know, the discourse, if I look at the leaders of Europe, give or take, it's not a question of one country more than another, the discourse is pathetic. And it's important in North Africa because everything, you look at North Africa, anything a French leader says or French politicians say is noted, maybe given too much importance. That's true, but you know, the French went into Algeria in 1830, okay? My grandfather was baptized in 1893 at the age of 15, 16. There are so many of these stories of crisscrossing, of double or treble identities. And it's in France when I've got friends who are members of, you know, of the Socialist Party or the Ghilès Party or whatever, who are local councillors, who are this or that. And whenever they've been to good universities, and they're all sons of workers, and they've done not right. And when they get a job, you know, or when you look at the local press, somebody says, oh, X has been appointed this. He's of Algerian origin. And these friends say to me, the day the French say he was appointed because he's competent, and the fact that he's called Mohammed or she's called Ishac really is beside the point. No, it goes on day in, day out. And, you know, and on the other side, it's not necessarily better because people, I mean, you know, in the case of Algeria, and the biggest joke in Algeria is that the fact that leaders should speak about the revolution, that's understandable. Nonetheless, the number of mujahideen in Algeria has stopped growing now, but until a few years ago, the number of mujahideen who had pensions or things went up every year. So the more they're dying, the more you get them. So at one point you think, okay, aren't there better ways of giving a taxi license or bar license, of inventing something as being a form of mujahideen? So the problems are on both sides, but the problem is it's tricky to, you know, to speak, to actually have a debate or discuss things as they are. And I don't know how, you know, in Tunisia, I think they have a chance. But as I come back to this, it matters in economic terms. Cultural wars won't solve anything. I know that these things have got to be debated. You know, the question of the skull, all these things have got to be debated. But they can become hostage, not just to arguments within the country. Don't forget, there's plenty of Saudi private money coming into North Africa, has for 25, 30 years. When I denounced it, when I mentioned this in London, publicly, in things, in the 80s, the Saudi ambassador used to complain to the foreign secretary. And I mentioned on the case of Algeria, very specifically, that was not to say the Algerian leaders in the 1880s were doing a good job. That wasn't the point. Just say there's so much Saudi money, Wahhabi money coming in. And then, lo and behold, the Minister of the Interior of Saudi Arabia, I was asked by somebody in Madrid who was Tunisian, who died a few years ago, who was one of the great supporters of Algerian independence, financed the financing of the war in Morocco. And he said to me in 1990, he said, the Minister of the Interior of Saudi Arabia would like to meet you. Very stupidly, I said to him, no. And he said, why? I said, well, because, my mother happens to be Jewish, and the Saudis distribute the protocols of Zion to visiting journalists, so there's so far I can go. It was a very stupid answer. Because a few months later, as the coalition forces went into Iraq, the Saudi Minister of the Interior said publicly that he would do everything he could to lower the flow of private Saudi money to the fees in Algeria. He said it publicly. So, there again, so it's all very well speaking of conspiracies, but and these things, and confronting the money from Saudi Arabia is something I can tell you not many Western media or people will do today. This is it's not the only problem, but it's very difficult to speak of these problems, and say, okay, these problems are maybe soluble, maybe we can move, but we've got to be more upfront. We've got to be more upfront. We've got to call things by their name. And in North Africa, I find, even in Algeria, I gave a talk on the German Foundation the other day about the press. And, I can find, people say to me, but do you dare speak and all that? But I said, look, as far as I'm concerned, from 95 to 2002, I wasn't let into Algeria. Okay, that was one thing, part of the game. But otherwise, if you speak to people with respect, if you understand where they come from, what their things are, you don't throw out anathems or don't try and dirty them, but just respect them. I think people are prepared to listen, but we've become, I think, since 9/11 has made this worse, we've just become a great shouting match is going on. And so, in the case of Tunisia, it would be worth going. You think French television would ever go to they'll only move to Tunisia if there's something with the Salafist or women being attacked. That's all they'll talk about. Now, that matters. Do you think anybody would do a program on the economics or the this? No, it doesn't interest them at all. And the media in general is doing this. Everybody's rushing to Tunisia. Is the Salafist, is they not, but speak about other things. No? We're just concentrating on that. It's a fixation on both sides. And then these cultural wars end up in nothing, because, nobody's going to prove anything one way or the other. But if you're in a country like France, where 25% of the people under 25, 28 are going to vote for Le Pen in the first round, where you go to suburbs of Paris in the middle or lower middle classes, and you speak to youngsters who are in professional schools, who are not... how do you define yourself? And they will say, oh, well, now we're defining ourselves as Christians. This is unheard of in France to say this since 1920. Unheard of. Oh, they define themselves as Christians. Well, where do we go from here, Sorry, too much politics. Because the thing is the economics are very beholden to politics.
Absolutely.
And there is no economic model. The problem is if there was an economic model, but the two are intermeshed, but then in a way this is so new, you see, because the advantage of the FT is that everybody was, the FT, I went to see the former Prime Minister of Tunisia, Ghilès, in February. I hadn't seen him for a number of years, and he said, what are you writing about this time? And I said, Sibéji, I'm just writing about economics. And he looked at me, he said, yes, you've only been writing about economics all your life, but congratulations, you did very well. So, everybody knows the politics are behind it, but the problem is to understand the politics, or at least to begin to have some idea of what the politics are. And this is, and I feel the West, the media, I will not be complimentary about the media, because I find that the media, I was just looking at the American papers last week, compared to 15 years ago. I don't know where we're going in the West, That's another question.
Yeah. Very good. We run out of time. Thank you.